Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the oddity of watching the Conservatives chase voters with a more extreme political philosophy who are pretty well entrenched, and Reform UK seemingly going in the opposite direction as they chase more moderate votes. After driving a wedge between themselves and Tommy Robinson's more active support this summer, Reform UK are now putting on a show of not wanting to be involved with anyone with an extremist past. But first, for daily political commentary, please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So Reform UK are setting themselves up with some sort of like news websites, not a bad idea. Perhaps a sign that Reform UK take direct communication with the public more seriously than other parties. You know, there's like Labour List and Conservative Home for Labour and Conservatives respectively. But those are activist driven. They're not really utilised properly by those parties. They don't have their own versions. But for contributors, for this Reform UK site, so there are going to be a few rules. The first of which is that you're not allowed to have any association with any far-right groups, and they name them. It includes EDL, BNP, Heritage Party, Britain First, you know, a selection of others. You know, actually, it's a good job that it only mentions far-right groups in Britain, though, isn't it? Because although Nigel Farage seems to have been careful not to be linked with any of these groups during his political lifetime, I don't think there's any evidence he has been associated with them. He has had plenty of collaborations with far-right groups around Europe. Now, it doesn't strictly rule out having a past association with these groups, but it does say writers can be excluded based on past associations at the discretion of the editors. Now, on the face of it, this should be quite challenging because quite a lot of local Reform UK activists and leaders certainly have affiliations with these groups. In fact, if you watch a local, cell might be too rude a word, but you know, a local Reform UK group and the people who are sort of driving it, like the chair of the group or something like that, if you watch them on social media, you do not have to wait very long before they decide to promote one or more of these groups on Facebook or Twitter. Now, the idea that Reform UK are really going to block anyone with associations with those named groups from having any involvement in their party is for the birds. They are trying to massively ramp up their ground operation before the next election. That means utilising people who are passionate about politics enough to go knocking on doors and delivering leaflets and have the time to do so as well and want to do it for Reform UK. Now, that is a tricky enough prospect for well-established parties, much less a new kid on the block. And anyone who is attracted to Reform UK and with that level of political passion, very likely to have been involved with one of those far-right groups mentioned here at some point, if not actively still. So let's be honest here. This little paragraph, which is quite similar to the one they have on the application form you fill in if you want to be a candidate for Reform UK, is likely just a device to be able to drop anyone who gets found out because, despite what Farage might say, I'm not convinced that the strict vetting process will be a thing for the party in the future, much more than it was for this year. But I do find it interesting to watch the Conservatives, who could easily attract more moderate voters if they would moderate their position. They are adopting an ever more extreme right-wing position on a number of areas in order to chase down the voters they lost to Reform UK. And in the opposite direction, you have Nigel Farage coveting those more moderate voters that voted Conservative this year and that the Conservatives right now seem to be taking for granted. At which point you have to ask, who's going to get the net gains here? Because they're both fishing from each other's waters. I am not entirely sure, to be honest. On the one hand, the people who voted Reform UK this year are not likely to be attracted by the main Tory pitch to them, because what the Conservatives are doing is they're shifting their focus close to reform positions, but not exactly aligned. And then they're making the claim, oh yeah, our policies may not be as robust as theirs, but we are the only ones who can realistically form a government. So basically they're presenting themselves as the pragmatic vote. But there are a couple of problems with this tactic. The first is that the people who voted Reform UK mostly don't care. You know, they voted Reform this year knowing they weren't voting for the government. And it's not just evident. Recent polling has shown a large number of Reform UK voters consciously still voted for Farage, even though They didn't even think their own Reform UK candidate could win locally, much less the party would nationally. The second problem is that if Reform UK can get close to the Conservative vote share in polling in the second half of this Parliament, and, there is, before the election, I mean, this is possible because before the election, it was known for a couple of years before, the polls, particularly the online polls, were inflating Reform UK's share of the vote all the way through, and including in the general election itself. Reform UK, there's a unintentional bias within the polling towards them, so it inflates their share of the vote slightly. There's not a lot of polling going on right now, but from what I have seen, it seems to be still doing that. So it could well be that at some point the Reform UK vote, because at the moment the Conservative vote seems to be buoyed by the fact that Labour are doing quite badly in the polls, but Labour are utterly convinced, not without potentially good reason, that as soon as their implementation of their policies bears fruit later this Parliament, then they'll start to do a lot better. Well, if they do, the Conservatives could start to do a lot worse, but it wouldn't necessarily impact Reform UK's share the vote too badly. So you could end up with Reform UK being roundabout level with the Conservatives in polling later this Parliament. Then people may actually believe that Reform UK could be the right-wing party of the future, and maybe even the immediate future. What the Conservatives are not doing is presenting policies that are more attractive to those Reform UK voters, or even pointing out how Reform's policies are unrealistic. It's really rare to hear any Tory criticising a Reform policy. And I don't think I've heard that much from the leader at all. In fact, Badenoch's grand strategy is to dismiss Labour's policies as unworkable when they are in a position to prove that they are workable by, making them work, and say nothing about the viability of Reform's policies, which will never be put to the test before the next election. So the only way you have of proving that Reform's policies are unworkable is by trying to persuade people with words. It's completely backwards, her policy, because if Badenoch believes that Labour's policies are unworkable, that will become evident in the next few years. But to prove that Reform's policies are unworkable, she has to persuade people, and she's not doing it. So Badenoch's Tories are attempting to take Reform votes back without any plan to present their policies as fundamentally better. And they're trying to do this for voters who are not that bothered about using their vote for the best credible choice for government. But in the other direction, I'm not sure what Farage's chances are with moderate voters either. Like, if these voters wouldn't back him this year, if they still voted Conservative this year, in spite of the right arse the party had made of their 14 years in government, how are Reform UK going to win those votes in a few years' time? How are they going to break down that loyalty? There will, I suppose, be some voters who do vote pragmatically, and they voted Conservatives this year because they thought they had the best chance of forming a government. And maybe if they think that Reform UK are in that position next time, sure, some of those might vote Reform UK. But I think they're likely to need a lot of persuading of that. And although I can see those conditions on their news site being used as an excuse to cut themselves off from anyone who is found to be associated with those groups, if it becomes a public issue, that is, otherwise they won't bother, it's not going to stop these things being brought up. If Farage tries to claim that his party is not far right and that it wants nothing to do with those he says they are, it's not going to stop those in the media who aren't interested in helping him bringing up the fact that, oh yeah, well, it doesn't half look like a lot of your activists support these groups. I'm also curious to see how Trump's government affects things. As we can't expect his second term to endear him to the moderate right-wing voters any more than his first term did. All that can really happen is that Farage could suffer if America really goes to the dogs in a very big and obvious way. It is possible that if the Tories continue to refuse to face reality and drop their focus on their actual target voters, for Reform UK to snaffle some. But I think it could be pretty hard work for Farage, especially if his offer is anything like the one from the election this summer. If he's making the same offer as he did this summer and those people didn't vote for him this summer, and then over the next few years the Tories are not hated as much on the right wing because they're now in opposition, so the people don't, in a few years' time, they're not going to be blaming the Tories for a lot of what they think is going wrong in the country now. They'll shift that blame to Labour, which is more natural for a right-wing voter anyway. it's really hard to see how Farage wins those voters over. You know, this summer it was a mix of anti-immigration and massive tax breaks for the poor in order to attract what had been the untapped left-wing but authoritarian voters, mostly neglected by other parties. But that's not really the sort of offer which attracts traditional Conservative voters. You know, the idea of, an initial tax break of like the income tax allowance of £20,000, that's not going to attract traditional Conservative voters. So I don't know how successful either of them are going to be. Though as Reform UK don't have that record of screwing up the country, it is possible they stand a better chance of making net gains from the Tories. But it would be funny if Farage, in trying to distance himself from the extremists, actually lost a chunk of their support and failed to make more from the moderate bloc he's aiming for now, who don't really like him. Something that could happen if Labour deliver on their most important promises and Trump delivers on his most important promises. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.